to a webinar about vendor management. My name is Marek Pikna, and I am a solution architect from CodeNow. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. So I'll be sharing my screen and we'll be going through the presentation. So today's webinar is related to vendor management, specifically with regard to software development and how to truly have control over the final result. During this webinar, we'll be taking a look at vendors in general, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll also be taking a look at a real-world case study, how exactly vendor management can go wrong. Then we'll be taking a look at a few points of areas to manage. Some areas that we see from our own experience where both the vendors as well as the companies receiving the services can do better. Finally, we'll be taking a look at a quick demonstration of an internal developer platform, how it can help with vendor management. And at the end, there will be a room for Q&A. So let's first begin with why vendor management matters. The good of it all, the positive part, is that vendors introduce very specific know-how. They have very specific abilities, very specific skills, very often related to a specific domain. And that's good. It's good to work with a vendor who is focused on some activity which is not your core business. It is completely fine to outsource this because you don't have the time, you don't have the skills, you don't have the people. It's fine. That is very reasonable, and the vendors are capable of doing a very good job. The outsourcing market itself is very, very large. But what, however, we see, and not just us personally, what we see often in reality, is that many of these projects, anything is reported between 25 to 50%, any of these projects may either fail completely or do not achieve their intended results. Almost a third of projects are canceled before completion. So what are the things that can go wrong? What poor vendor management can result in, first things first, is software delivery just not on time. As a result, the budget overruns, and as a result, you often get to technical debt, meaning that in order to get something out quickly, the developers of the teams take the shortest path they can, so they deliver something, but in the year, it's going to bite them, simply because it is not the proper solution. The impact itself is very cascading, because not only is your budget overrun, you're also missing your market window. Your competition is able to get ahead of you. The stakeholders are, for very good reasons, going to be more and more frustrated. You're also going to be running into operational risks, for instance, related to ownership of your own intellectual property. You may end up losing control and completely depending on a single vendor. And of course, at the end of it all, is that the delivery itself may not be of desired quality, which may be caused by insufficient testing. It may be also just simply because the project was set up wrong. Of course, that's fair. It may also be because of fragmented delivery. Fragmented delivery meaning that you are dependent, or the project is dependent on multiple people, multiple teams, maybe even multiple vendors, and each of them doing a small part and not working together completely. If there is one thing that you should definitely take from this webinar as the key takeaway, the one thing that you end up remembering, it is that the fatal flaw is to be passive, to just sign the contract, set it, and passively wait for results. This passive approach surrenders control and visibility and ends up with you just hoping for a proper result. So the one takeaway here is never be passive when working with vendors. The critical challenges to consider are many, but the ones that we would like to point out here, one is related to ongoing control. Exactly this kind of passivity, meaning you end up signing a contract and then you just wait. If you do not, or if you do wait, what tends to happen is that problems slowly and silently accumulate until the project is on fire. And when you actually are solving it, it's not that the fire is starting, it's already going. Another issue to consider is related to documentation. People typically consider documentation to be related to technical details, but in reality, there is more to it. It is important for this documentation to be comprehensive. For instance, for the topic how to maintain, how to change things, how to move forward. This is especially important when going into transferability. And of course, when you're working with vendors and you're going with custom software delivery, it can lead to the best possible fit because they are doing it exactly how you want it to be. The solution is going to work exactly how you want. That is good. However, the result is proprietary software that someone needs to maintain. If any changes to be done, it needs to be handled. The solutions do work, but are you truly able to own them? Are you able to today, quote unquote, turn off the vendor and actually take over the control? It's important for the solutions to work not only today, but even, for instance, in the next 5 years. And all of this accumulates in the trap, which is called vendor lock-in, which means that you simply have to work with a single vendor and you're stuck. If you want to switch, you need to completely start over. This not only results in complete dependency on one organization, but obviously, even if that were not the only problem, you're also experiencing massive power imbalance. Any kind of negotiating leverage cannot be talked about because you are the dependent subject. These things are things which we can see through the last few decades on many large-size outsourcing projects. A beautiful example, which has been really well documented, is the one for the National Program for IT in the UK for the National Health Service. The program was intending to, quote unquote, bring NHS into the 21st century. So it's a digitalization project. The contracts of this project, which was massive, were split to large vendors, the size of Fujitsu or British Telecom, Accenture. At the end of it, the costs ballooned to nearly 12 billion Great British pounds. So what exactly went wrong? First things first, the accountability of vendors was really weak. The contracts were massive and they were extremely inflexible. As a result, monitoring performance was really difficult. Also, a big part of it is that they did experience this kind of vendor locking. Of course, there were more of them. However, they were locked. Why? Because NHS was not the actual owner of their own intellectual property. As a result, even if a vendor was underperforming and everyone knew what to do, it was now impossible to make the switch. The reporting itself was very opaque. The suppliers were not obligated to provide detailed visibility, and as such, it was even difficult to see any potential issues arising. And fragmented delivery was also one of the high points here. The solutions themselves were to be integrated. However, all of them went through different delivery patterns, all of them had different tech stacks, different solutions to problems, and as a result, the integrations result in massive slowdowns. Slowdowns are not just the fact that you get the solution later, it's also extra costs. And finally, the risk management itself was also inadequate because the expectation was to go with a big bang. That's the next day, someone is able to press enter on their keyboard, launch the solution, and the rollout will be uniform and work. What was needed in reality were incremental pilots with feedback loops. There is many examples other than this. For instance, the project of Denver International Airport for automated luggage transportation, instead of 2 years, ended up taking 16 years and ballooned from $200 million to 560. In the Czech Republic, for instance, there was a project, or currently is running, of e-recept in also healthcare. Started, currently is a success, currently works completely fine. However, the rollout was extremely painful with data quality issues, led to unnecessary large and significant extra costs. Similar story for vehicle registry, where the rollout ended up having constant crashes on release, got to newspapers and never working. And a significant issue here, difficulty, was really weak vendor accountability. No proper SLAs, no performance criteria, no acceptance criteria. So we can see how poor vendor management can really make you suffer. So now the topic goes to how to get it right, how to actually work with vendors correctly. And we see a few areas that we would like to share with you, how even starting today, you're able to work with vendors better and profit from them. The first thing is direct access to source codes or artifacts or any other result of their work. Second area is related to incremental cooperation cadence, meaning that you end up working together, talking together, understanding where you are to prevent issues. We're going to be also taking a look at continuous validation, because that's the part that we see as extremely important. Transparent and auditable delivery, how knowing the team itself is incredibly important, what it means to actually own the intellectual property, and how to end up preventing vendor locking, and ensuring consistent delivery model, meaning that even if you work with many vendors, they follow the same delivery model. We're not going to be discussing in the scope of this webinar topics such as contracting or project management. They are very important, however, not in scope here. We're also going to be talking about all of this in relation to internal developer platforms, IDPs. These are products dedicated to application developers and the rest of engineering. And essentially what they are is an integration or orchestration layer of technologies and tools into golden paths, so that the engineers don't have to solve things, how to build, how to deploy, what kind of pipeline to run, what kind of tests for security and so on, etc., etc. All of this results in faster delivery, but in the scope of vendor management, lowers the cognitive load, enables the developers to be self-serviced, to be empowered to deliver end-to-end. So let's take a look at each and every single area. The first part that we see that is extremely valuable is direct access to source codes or possibly any other artifacts. Obviously, it's not always possible to have direct access. However, there are various other means how to enable this, for instance, escrow agreements or anything else. Why is this important? Why do you benefit from this? Because then you're able to actually work with code quality and guarantee it. If there is any, let's say, InfoSec requirements, you are actually able to validate them. The delivery itself, how it works, is completely standardized by you because you are able to enforce certain rules. And you're also, it is the first step how to possibly enable any kind of takeover if need be. If you have an IDP, the way you benefit from that is that you have complete visibility over all of the phases of SDLC in real time. Any change is completely auditable, and you end up receiving visibility into the development state, not just the engineers themselves, but even potentially the highest management. We also see ourselves, even myself as a vendor, the significant benefit of incremental cooperation cadence. Having any kind of, for instance, weekly status check-ins enables product validation. It also enables discussing if there is any blockers. Depending on the type of project, it may make sense to, for instance, have architecture check-ins. In case of integration projects, it makes complete sense. What we see as really beneficial is having direct, responsible persons on both sides. Very commonly referred to as single points of contact. Why is this important? Because one significant part of where software projects may fail is that issues tend to very silently pile up and creep up. The more this happens, the more and more difficult it is to actually perform any kind of change. Having these kind of check-ins enables course correction when any kind of an issue arises and enables steering of changes. Having an IDP makes you really benefit here by having a singular environment for information sharing, decision-making, and transparency over any kind of metrics. We see it extremely beneficial to continuously validate and test. This has various forms in practice. We may be talking about continuous testing of software feasibility, adhering to technical rules or technical specifications, having unit testing, integration, smoke, end-to-end testing, etc., etc. The ability potentially to run continuous integration or delivery, meaning that you're able to any day get the newest possible version of your software. That is how we're related to technical feasibility. It's also important to validate with the users, ideally with a potential end user. it's extremely beneficial to first to prototype features and really validate this is where we want to go, this is how it should work, and constantly demonstrate them. Why? One part is obvious for technical validation, because at the end of it all, the solution needs to work properly. User validation is, however, very important because it turns out that people are notoriously weak at explaining what they actually want in software, and very often they actually end up receiving something else than they initially intended to. So it's very beneficial to constantly validate, is this what we had in mind? The good part, the side note here, is that vendors thrive on having this proper feedback. They actually want it, and the solutions end up being better for it. Having an internal developer platform really helps here as well, because you end up enforcing certain golden paths, enforcing certain processes for testing, how it should work, what should be in the pipelines, and you do this in a standard way for each and every single vendor. This means that no vendor can go through any other process. Every one of them has to go through the exact same flow, so you can guarantee certain quality of the deliveries. Having transparent and auditable delivery is also a big portion here. It's very beneficial to have strong visibility into the delivery cycle itself. This does not only mean, for instance, seeing certain tickets, it also means being able to go into configuration management. How exactly are each environments configured? What do we do to configure them ourselves? What about release notes and documentation? What happened when we have these 10 new versions? What actually changed between them? This is extremely beneficial because it leads to building expectations on both sides. Both sides know what to expect and when. You end up obtaining this knowledge continuity, which means that you know where to pick up, even if some horrible scenario occurs. Each change in the solutions is completely traceable. You are able to completely federate access and hence protect sensitive data and infrastructure. You're also able to completely automate tracing, and hence, if there's any regulatory requirements, you're able to satisfy them. This is the, let's say, golden area for an internal developer platform, because by using it or having the developers use it, your entire company benefits from having a single platform with deep reporting and deep visibility into the deliveries themselves and how they work. Knowing the team is also very beneficial. The teams themselves should be as independent as possible. Very often you may see terms such as independent value streams, which in essence simply means that they are empowered and able to deliver their solutions end to end without depending on anyone else. What you get to otherwise is that you are at risk of fragmented delivery, meaning that in order for the team to deliver something, they depend on somebody else. And as a result, because inter-team communication is always expensive and slow, you rise to slowdowns. Those are extra costs. Knowing the team you're working with very much helps you. Why? You're able to assess execution risk much better. You're able to even expect it and foresee it. You knew that for the type of work, 2 front-end engineers were required, but now there is none on the team. So what you need to find a solution. It also gives you visibility into the process development cycle, exactly who does what, when, how, and so on. If there's any changes in the organization, you are aware of them. And it enables you to clearly define any kind of responsibility boundaries. Who is responsible for what? Having an internal developer platform helps once again, because it empowers your team to be able to do delivery end to end, or the team of the vendor rather, and it gives you the clear visibility into their delivery cycle and who does what and how do they work. At the end of it all, what is extremely important is to be able to own your intellectual property. All of your intellectual property should remain in your environment and in your control. Very often, people tend to consider intellectual property as just source codes or the artifacts, but that's only a small piece of the puzzle. Consider, for instance, if the vendor, for whatever reason, stops working with you today, are you able to actually take over, continue the development, maintain, deploy to production, and so on? To be able to do this means that you actually do own the intellectual property. However, very often, this is what we see in reality is that this is not exactly managed. So as a result, you want to be able to enable immediate takeover. If you're able to do that, you are able to truly own and control your intellectual property. Having an internal developer platform here is immensely helpful because this delivery process, the flow of it, is completely standardized for each and every single vendor. That means that on the other side, the takeover is also standardized because you know exactly what to do and you're getting better at the process over time, the more that you go with it. The platform itself is just a single platform for all accesses when working with all the vendors, which leads us exactly to the point of consistent delivery models. Even if you're working with multiple vendors on multiple different projects across your large organization, for instance, they are working in the same delivery model. So ideally, all the delivery should be done through the same means if possible. Of course, it may not be, but ideally, it should strive to be as close to each other as possible. This means that strategy for source code management, for the build pipeline, deployment, configuration management, and so on, should always strive to go to the same means. Because this leads to clear definition of boundaries for all vendors and exactly how you work with them. This also lets you, going back one slide, to protect your IP further and enable the takeover through following the same process. Internal developer platform here is immensely helping because it federates the software delivery. It enforces following certain standards and following certain processes. Now, a part that also I believe needs to be covered is related to the process itself. Very often, even after years, there are constant discussions about agile and waterfall and so on. And agile itself is often heralded as a delivery process to help through iterative development cycles, constant user validation. And we can even see where they came from because as vendors, these were exactly the pain points they were experiencing just from the other side. The thing is, however, that the true value of agile is that it is valuable when the level of uncertainty is high, which means that every 2 weeks you can possibly change course of direction. It needs to be considered that the process itself, however, is adaptive, which means that you, even if it's waterfall, even if it's anything else, there's various models how to work. The important part is that you remain active when working with vendors. So we've been talking about internal developer platforms. Let's take a look at CodeNow, an internal developer platform. And this is the initial view after logging in. And already what I see is a list of applications within a certain organization. These are just certain demo applications. And already I have a high level documentation of what exactly is running where. I can see information about the builds. I can see information about deployments, about components, what is running where. I can even go into detail for a certain application, see exactly the environments it's related to, who are the people working on it, possibly some kind of documentation. I can see the build history, what kind of tests did fail, if they failed, and so on and so forth. I can see all of the packages of the application released, possibly with certain labels, such as which contains a major change or breaking change, how they're configured for various environments, for production, for dev, for stage, and so on, where are they actually deployed. And the developers deliver software the way they know, the way they work with. They use the standard source code management tool, they use Git, and so on. And an internal developer platform empowers them to work exactly, to be empowered for their team to work how they have to, perform all their work, and your team, your organization, to be able to really have visibility and control over the delivery cycle. So having an internal development platform really helps streamline vendor management. Of course, there is more to consider, but this kind of tooling already makes you benefit heavily. Why? First area that's really significantly powerful is related to visibility and control. You are able to truly see into your solutions ecosystem. What is running where? How many resources are consumed? What is the database underneath? Who is actively developing the solutions? When did they make a certain change? How much time is spent on operations? All of these topics are trivially answered by using an internal developer platform. Even areas such as software quality and ownership of your intellectual property, the platforms enforce a consistent delivery process model for all of the vendors that you're working with. All of them deliver a software through the same means. That means that no longer that one vendor sends you packages, the other one artifacts, the other one access to Git, the other one Docker containers. No, it always goes through the same process, and you retain full control of all solutions and their delivery model. Topics of reporting: who, what, when, where. Answering these becomes trivial. Questions such as who developed a feature X, who pushed it into prod, and when, now become completely trivialized. Even going further, such as what was in the change, how long did it take, and so on. And you very much prevent vendor lock-in, simply because you have complete control over your environment, you have complete control over your intellectual property. It is very easy to quote unquote switch off and switch on and turn off a certain vendor. This means that onboarding and offboarding is very streamlined and simplified. The key takeaways of this webinar are that first and foremost, active management is essential. That means having regular cadence of check-ins or working with the vendors, knowing the team, and so on and so forth. This ends up preventing issues from silently creeping up and your solutions actually being on fire. The reality to always consider is that vendors thrive on this feedback and they desire this feedback because it is very important for them as well. Strive to protect your investment. You invested into certain solutions and you should strive to also protect those investments. This means that you should ensure ownership of your IP, access to source codes, comprehensive documentation. This does not mean only documentation of the technicalities of the solution, but really how do you keep going forward? What is the usage pattern? What is the maintenance? What you should strive to is for your solutions to not be working and usable and feasible today, but in the next 5, 10, 20 years. That obviously depends on your requirements, but you should be striving to having them future-proof. You should also strive to build for transition. What that means is that you should be prepared for eventual potential transition. Of course, this does not mean that you should stop working with a certain vendor after some time. If you're happy with the cooperation, great, keep going. But you should always be able to have the ability to take over. This does not mean that you are going to, but that you're able to. That is essentially a requirement for you to be working with, should not be considered a nice to have, because otherwise you are surrendering control. That is it for this webinar. I would also like to invite you for our next webinar on December 18th. And the topic of this webinar is deliver software faster. And if there's any questions, this is the proper room. If there's any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Otherwise, have a great day.